Yerba mate is a beverage. It's an infusion, basically like tea, made from the dried leaves and sometimes the little twigs of a specific plant.
The specific plant got a name.
Yep, it shows up everywhere in the sources. Ilex paraguayensis.
Ilex paraguayensis. Sounds very scientific. What is it in like normal plant terms?
It's actually a type of holly, an evergreen tree, and it's native to a particular area in subtropical South America. Think Paraguay, northern Argentina, southern Brazil, Uruguay. That's its home turf.
A holly tree from South America.
Yeah.
Okay. And what makes its leaves special? Why these leaves?
Well, the sources highlight that they're packed with certain compounds. Caffeine's a big one everyone knows, but they're also nutrients and, really importantly, a whole load of antioxidants. These are kind of the key players when we talk about its effects later on.
Got it. South American holly infusion, caffeine, nutrients, antioxidants. That's the baseline. But as you said, the history is huge here. It's not some new invention.
Oh, not at all. Its roots go way back to the indigenous Guaranese people. They lived in the areas that are now Paraguay, parts of Argentina, Brazil. They were the original users, the original cultivators.
And what did it mean to them? Was it just like their morning coffee?
Apparently much more than that. The sources describe it as having like a sacred status. It was used in rituals, for healing, for social bonding, but also just part of daily life. Seems it was really woven into their culture.
Wow, sacred ritual and daily drink. That's quite a combo. So how did things change when the Spanish arrived?
Well, the colonizers saw how important it was, and they adopted it too. But the big shift, according to the sources, came in the 17th century with the Jesuit missionaries.
Ah, the Jesuits. They pop up in the sources quite a bit. What did they do?
They basically saw its potential, both locally and maybe for export. So they started cultivating it more systematically. Think organized plantations, not just harvesting wild plants. This really ramped up production and trade.
So they kind of industrialized it in a way, brought organized farming to it?
Pretty much, yeah. They became the big players in yerba mate for a while.
Yeah.
But then there's this really interesting twist the sources mention. When the Jesuit order was kicked out or dissolved around 1775, those plantations were basically abandoned, destroyed even.
No way.
Yeah.
So all that knowledge, the setup, just vanished.
Largely, yes. The sources say that the expertise for cultivating it professionally was really hard to get back. It apparently wasn't until like the mid-20th century that large-scale cultivation properly recovered. That's a huge gap, over 150 years.
That's incredible. I had no idea about that gap. So indigenous sacred drink, Jesuit industry, long decline, then a modern comeback. What's its status like now in South America?
Oh, today it's absolutely massive. It's fundamental in Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, southern Brazil. It's just part of the fabric of daily life. And more than just a drink, it's a huge symbol of friendship, community, hospitality.
Right, and that classic image of sharing it, the sources describe that ritual.
Exactly. That's the iconic way. You have the special cup, the matero or gourd, and the middle straw with a filter, the bombeo. Someone prepares it, fills the gourd with yerba, adds hot water, and then gets passed around the group. Everyone sips, passes it back, the server refills, passes it on.
So it's inherently social, that traditional method, not usually just making a cup for yourself.
Yeah, it's about connection, sharing time. And while South America is its heartland, the sources mention it spread to some really unexpected places too.
That blew my mind a bit. The bit about Syria and Lebanon, the Druze and Alawite communities there apparently drink a lot of it. How did that happen?
Isn't that fascinating? The sources trace it back to Syrian immigrants who went to Argentina, probably in the 19th century. They picked up the yerba mate habit there, and then when they returned or kept ties back home, they brought the tradition with them. A classic example of culture traveling through migration.
That's one of those real, interesting moments from the sources. You just wouldn't connect those dots otherwise.
Shows how these things spread. And beyond that specific connection, the sources note yerba mate is now showing up globally in modern products.
Yeah, I've definitely seen those energy drinks, bottled iced teas with yerba mate listed.
Exactly. So it's gone from ancient ritual to regional staple to now a global ingredient. Speaks to its growing recognition, I guess.
Okay, before we get into the plant details, quick question on the name. Sometimes you see mate with an accent mark. What's the deal with that?
Good question. So yerba mate. Yerba is Spanish for herb, basically. And mate comes from Quechua, mate, which meant the gourd, the container, or maybe the infusion itself. So kind of like gourd herb.
And the accent on the E.
Right. So in Spanish, it's pronounced M-A-H-Te, stress on the first syllable. The sources suggest the spelling mate with the accent isn't standard Spanish, but likely came from English or French speakers, maybe like café, to signal that the final E isn't silent like in the English word mate for a friend. It just helps non-Spanish speakers say it right.
Ah, okay, that makes sense. Pronunciation sorted. Now let's zoom in on the plant itself. Ilex paraguayensis. What's it actually look like?
Well, the sources say it starts as a shrub, but can grow into a full-on tree. And quite a decent size, too, like 8 to 15 meters tall. That's maybe 25 to 50 feet.
That's way bigger than I pictured for a holly.
Yeah, it's a proper tree. Evergreen leaves, like you expect, with serrated edges. The size varies, but maybe up to 11 centimeters long. Flowers are small, greenish, white, 4 petals. And it produces these little red fruits, technically drupes, like tiny berries, about 5–8 millimeters across, with the seeds inside.
Okay, medium tree, holly-like leaves, red berries. What kind of climate does it like? Where does it grow best?
Definitely subtropical. The sources really stress high humidity and lots of rain, over 1,200 millimeters a year, they specify. Temperature-wise, it's apparently less picky, can even handle down to -6 Celsius, which is pretty cold for a subtropical plant.
-6 C. Wow, that's surprisingly tough. And there was one little detail in the sources about extrafloral nectaries. What are those?
Yeah, one source mentioned that. They're basically little glands on the leaves outside the flowers, hence extra floral that ooze nectar. This can attract things like ants, which then might help protect the plant from bugs that want to eat it. Kind of a cool little defense mechanism.
Neat detail. Okay, so we know the plant. How does it get from being leaves on a tree to that dried stuff people brew? The processing seems pretty involved and maybe important later.
Oh, definitely. The processing is key to the final product. It starts with how it's grown, could be wild, managed wild, or on plantations, and then the harvest.
What do they actually harvest?
The fresh leaves and the younger softer stems, usually stuff that's grown in the last 6 to 12 months. Then they bundle it up and take it for processing.
First step at the processing plant.
It's a really quick, intense heat treatment called roasting or blanching or sometimes sapicata. We're talking maybe 10 seconds up to 3 minutes. But at super high temperatures up to 500 degrees Celsius.
500 C for just seconds. That sounds extreme. Why do that?
The main reason is to zap the enzymes in the leaves, especially one called polyphenol oxidase. If you don't, the leaves oxidize fast, turn brown, lose flavor, things like a cut apple. This quick heat stops that, preserves the green color, the aroma, the good stuff.
How do they apply that heat? Fire.
Traditionally, yeah, sometimes direct exposure to flames or hot gases, maybe in a rotating drum. Modern places often use big belt dryers with blasts of hot air instead.
That difference, open fire, potentially smoky versus just hot air, feels like something we should keep in mind.
It definitely comes up later, yeah.
Yeah.
So after that quick blast of heat comes the drying. This is slower, takes longer, maybe 8 to 24 hours, and at lower temps, up to about 100 Celsius.
And the purpose of drying is just to dry it out.
Pretty much. Get the moisture content way down to around 4.5%, the sources say. Makes it stable, ready for storage.
Is smoke involved in this drying stage too, potentially?
It can be. The sources mention drying chambers often use hot air that might come from burning wood, so it can contain smoke. Depending on the setup, the yerba might get exposed to smoke during that initial roast and the longer drying.
Okay, roasted, dried. What's next?
Maturation, or aging. The crushed, dried stuff gets stored, often in big cement or cedar rooms. For quite a while, at least 12 months is mentioned.
A whole year just sitting there. Why? What does aging do?
2 main things, according to the sources. First, it develops the specific flavor profile people expect from cured yerba mate. Second, and this is really interesting, the sources say this aging process actually boosts the concentration of some key compounds, the methylxanthines like caffeine and theobromine, and those beneficial polyphenols. It also increases the overall antioxidant activity.
Wait, so aging makes it better in terms of those compounds, not just tastier? That's cool.
Exactly. After it's aged, it gets sieved. This separates the leaf bits from the twigs and stems.
But wait, don't they often sell it with twigs included? Why separate them then?
Good point. The leaves have most of the active compounds and flavor. The twigs have less, but they serve a purpose, especially in the traditional gourd method. They help stop the fine leaf powder from clogging the bombilla. Plus, including twigs makes the final product cheaper.
Ah, practical and economic reasons. And there are different types based on twig content.
Yeah, the sources mention despalada, which means without stems, so mostly leaf, theoretically less than 10% twigs, and alevaria, which is the more common type, with maybe around 35% twigs. Brands have their own specific ratios.
And then finally they back it up.
Usually crushed a bit more than packaged. The sources also say sometimes flavorings are added, like citrus essences for those flavored varieties.
Okay, that's the whole journey from leaf to bag. Now, how do people actually make the drink? We touched on the sharing ritual.
Right, that's the classic way. Using the Matero gourd and bombilla straw, the steps outlined are fill the gourd maybe 2/3 full with yerba, tilt it, make a little slope, then pour a splash of cold water onto the lower part.
Cold water first. Why?
Sources say it helps moisten the leaves gently, maybe protect some nutrients from the initial shock of hot water. Once that's absorbed, then you add the hot water.
And the temperature is super important here, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. The sources really hammer this point home, especially thinking about potential risks later. You use hot water, specifically 70 to 80 degrees Celsius. That's about 160 to 175 Fahrenheit. Definitely not boiling, they stress. Pour it into that moistened area, let it sit a moment, then sip through the bombilla.
And the key is you keep doing that, refilling.
Yes, that's the whole point of the traditional session. You refill that same gourd with hot water over and over, sometimes like 20 times until the flavor's gone or washed out.
Wow, same leaves, many infusions. Are there simpler ways for, like, beginners?
Yeah, for sure. The sources mentioned using a French press is easier, and of course yerba mate tea bags exist. Super convenient, though maybe not as strong or complex in flavor.
Any big regional differences in how it's drunk?
Definitely. Hot meat is common, especially in Argentina and Uruguay. But then you have terre, the cold version. Super popular in Paraguay, parts of Brazil, especially when it's hot out. Made with ice-cold water, sometimes juice, maybe ice and citrus slices thrown in.
And even the hot versions vary.
Yeah, like chimarrão in southern Brazil. It's usually greener, foamier, made with a finer grind of yerba. And you see folks in Uruguay walking around with their gourds and thermoses all day, ready for mate anytime. It really shows how integrated it is.
It really does. Given how much they drink, do the sources say how much dry leaf that translates to per person?
They give some estimates. Average daily use in those core countries might be 12 to 23 grams of dry leaf, which makes about a liter of the drink. And the yearly numbers are huge. Uruguay is top, like 8-10 kilos per person per year. Argentina, 6 to 5 kilos. Southern Brazil, 3-7 kilos.
10 kilograms a year per person.
Yeah.
That is a lot of yerba mate. Really highlights how central it is.
It's a massive part of their diet and culture. And it's not only consumed as a drink, the sources point out.
Right, the extracts and things we mentioned before.
Exactly. Concentrated extracts are finding their way into pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, food products. The sources note a real uptick in interest in patents, especially since around 2008.
What kind of modern uses are we talking about?
Well, patents for things like weight loss aids, managing blood sugar and cholesterol, metabolic syndrome, antioxidant supplements. It's in energy drinks, obviously, cold beverages, even products claiming to help process alcohol.
And that packaging idea was pretty wild, too.
Yeah, using yerba mate extract in biodegradable films. Apparently, it helps them break down. Plus, its antioxidant properties and color-changing ability with pH could make it useful for smart packaging that shows if food is still fresh.
Wow. From sacred drink to potentially smart food wrap. That's quite the spectrum. Okay, so we know the journey, the uses. Let's get into the nitty-gritty science. What's inside these leaves? The chemistry seems pretty complex.
It is, but the sources give a good breakdown. Macronutrient-wise, dried leaves are mostly carbs, over 80%, then a bit of protein and fat. But the really active compounds, the ones doing interesting things, are the secondary metabolites.
Secondary metabolites, those are the ones with the effects.
Exactly. The big categories are purine alkaloids, think caffeine, then polyphenols, saponins, minerals, vitamins, and some other things like terpenes and fatty acids.
Okay, let's start with those purine alkaloids. Caffeine city, right?
Yep, caffeine's the main one, about 1–2% of the dry leaf weight. A single traditional cup might have, say, 30–50 milligrams, but that varies a lot.
How does that stack up against coffee or tea?
Generally less caffeine than a typical brewed coffee. Coffee might be 80–120 milligrams, but often a bit more than green tea, which is usually around 25–35 milligrams per cup.
So kind of in the middle.
For a single serving, yeah. But yerba mate also has theobromine, maybe up to almost 1%. That's a stimulant in chocolate, milder than caffeine. And trace amounts of theophylline, another mild one.
Where are these stimulants concentrated? Leaves or stems?
Mostly in the leaves. Stems have much less. And the sources say levels vary by region and brand. One study found Uruguayan yerba had the highest caffeine and theobromine.
And crucially, how you make it massively affects how much you get, right? Because of the refill.
Exactly. This is key. Extraction happens over time. One study even found that cold brew, terray, could pull out more caffeine and theobromine in the first few infusions compared to a quick hot steep like some Tamarana styles.
More from cold water. That seems counterintuitive.
Well, extraction is tricky. For hot water, the best temp for caffeine seemed to be around 70 degrees C for a long steep like 45–60 minutes. Boiling was actually less effective. So while one quick hot pour doesn't get it all, those repeated traditional refills mean you're getting a lot cumulatively. That's why total intake in a session can be high, maybe over 260 milligrams.
The sources had those comparisons, right? Like per 100 milliliters.
Yeah, those were helpful. Like 100 milliliters of terray might have caffeine, like 24 milliliters of espresso, while Tremoral was like 10 milliliters of espresso. For theobromine, 100 milliliters of terray had the equivalent of about 14–15 grams of milk chocolate. Puts the amounts in context.
Definitely helpful comparisons. Okay, beyond stimulants, polyphenols. You called it an antioxidant powerhouse because of these.
Yes, they're a huge component and a big reason for the health buzz. They're antioxidants, meaning they help protect your cells from damage caused by free radicals.
Which specific polyphenols are the stars here?
Chlorogenic acid is the main one, apparently dominant in the leaves, plus related compounds like catheic acid, quinic acid. Interestingly, some specific ones, like caffeoylshikimic acid, seem to be formed during the roasting process.
How much are we talking total?
Quite a bit. Sources estimate a single cup from 5 grams of leaves could give you 0.5 to 0.9 grams of total polyphenols. That's a pretty hefty dose of antioxidants.
Does where it's grown or how it's processed matter for these?
Seems so. Sunny plantations in Paraguay were mentioned as being particularly rich. And like the alkaloids, extraction varies. One study found the second infusion often had the most polyphenols. And another study, again surprisingly, found cold terray pulled out more polyphenols than hot chamarron in some later refills.
Cold brew winning again for some compounds.
Seems that way sometimes, yeah. The sources also list other flavonoids, rutin, quercetin, camphorol, luteolin, all known antioxidants too.
And you can tweak the brewing to target specific compounds.
Apparently. One study looked at maximizing chlorogenic acid and found 95 degrees seawater for 16 minutes. Did the trick, though, that's hotter than usually recommended and only for a single steep.
Fascinating how much prep matters. What about saponins? They contribute the bitterness.
Yeah, yerba mate has these bitter, water-soluble compounds called triterpene saponins. Specific ones are named mate saponins 1 to 5 in the sources.
How much is in there?
Total content in the dry leaf is maybe around 7 to 11-ish milligrams per gram.
Do they dissolve well in water?
The sources say they're actually less soluble in water than in some other solvents. So while they add bitterness, the amount you drink might be lower than the total amount in the leaf.
And scientists use fancy techniques to study these.
Yeah, things like Maldil DMS to get a full picture and check for any weird additives or contaminants.
Okay, how about minerals? Is it a good source?
It provides several. The main ones mentioned are potassium, calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus.
Any important trace minerals?
Manganese and iron seem to be the most common. Mineral levels can definitely vary depending on the soil and growing conditions.
Did the sources raise any red flags about minerals? Toxic ones?
They did look for them. Things like cadmium, arsenic, lead were found in some samples. Generally, the levels were below the official safety limits. However, one specific Brazilian tea sample mentioned did exceed the cadmium limit by nearly 20%. So mostly okay, but needs watching.
Good to know. Were any toxic ones definitely not found?
Yes. One study noted that antimony, selenium, silver, and bismuth weren't detected at all.
And the mineral profile can be like a fingerprint to tell where it's from.
Correct. Analyzing the mineral pattern can help verify the origin and even spot if someone's mixed in other herbs.
Cover. Any other compounds worth mentioning?
Vitamins are mostly water-soluble ones like C and B vitamins, B1, B2, B6. Some sources mention small amounts of A and E too. Fatty acids, including omega types like linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid. Interestingly, one study found more linoleic acid in room temperature infusions versus hot.
And the smell. Essential oils.
Yes, and roasting really changes these. Fresh floral notes from compounds like limon decrease, while sweet, smoky notes from compounds like furfural increase. That's why roasted mate smells and tastes different from green.
Okay, so chemistry is complex, shaped by plant, place, and process. Now, we need to address something linked to that process. PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons.
Right, this is important. PAHs are a group of chemicals known to be toxic and potentially carcinogenic, meaning they could increase cancer risk.
And how do they get into yerba mate?
The sources mainly point to the high heat processing steps, roasting and drying, especially if wood smoke is involved. Burning wood and plant material creates them. Contamination from the environment during growth is also possible.
So directly linked to those smoky processing methods we talked about.
That seems to be the main pathway identified in the sources. They show data with varying PAH levels in dried yerba, mentioning benzoapyrene specifically as a problematic one found in different products.
And this seems crucial how much actually gets into the drink.
Yes, this is a really key point the sources emphasize. Apparently, only a small fraction of these PAH, like benzopyrene, actually transfers from the leaf into the water when you brew it. The sources cited estimate maybe only up to 10% gets extracted.
Only 10%. That significantly lowers the exposure compared to what's in the dry leaf itself.
That's what the research suggests. It's not zero, but the amount you actually ingest by drinking is considerably lower than the total contamination level in the raw material.
Okay, that's a really thorough look at the what. Now let's talk what does it do? The potential health effects. This is where traditional use meets modern science.
Exactly, the pharmacological activity. What happens when these compounds interact with our bodies? The research spans lab dishes, animal studies, and human trials, trying to understand the why behind the reputation.
Let's start with the obvious, the stimulant effect. Caffeine, yes, but is that the whole story?
Well, caffeine is a big part. A single serving might be comparable to coffee, maybe 80 milligrams, but remember the repeated refills? Total intake in a session can get quite high, potentially over 260 milligrams. Drinkers often report sustained energy, focus, sometimes without the coffee jitters. It stimulates the central nervous system, boosts metabolism, affects muscles.
Any downside to too much stimulation?
Oh yeah, standard caffeine stuff. Too much can cause stomach upset, heart palpitations, anxiety, sleep problems, as the sources list. Like anything with caffeine, moderation is key.
Okay, beyond energy, the antioxidant power. What's the evidence there?
Pretty strong, according to the sources, directly linked to those polyphenols, especially chlorogenic acid. Studies show its antioxidant activity is comparable to synthetic ones and similar to or even better than green tea. And importantly, roasting doesn't seem to kill this benefit.
Have they tested this in people?
Yes. One cited study had healthy people take a yerba mate extract for 60 days. They found increased antioxidant capacity in their blood, higher levels of protective enzymes, and lower markers of cell damage. It supports the idea it helps fight oxidative stress.
Okay, another major area in the sources was lipid metabolism and cardiovascular health, fats, and heart health.
Yeah, this gets a lot of attention. A key focus is preventing atherosclerosis plaque buildup in arteries. Yerba mate seems to help by stopping LDL cholesterol, the bad kind, from oxidizing. Oxidized LDL is a big driver of plaque.
How do they know this?
From lab tests showing it protects LDL, animal studies showing lower cholesterol and less plaque, and human trials looking at these effects. One really interesting mechanism involves an enzyme called PON1. It travels with HDL, the good cholesterol, and helps protect LDL. The sources say yerba mate extracts don't just prevent PON1 loss, they can actually increase its activity by about 10%, which coffee didn't do in comparison.
So it helps boost our own natural artery protection.
That's the idea, and the human trials are compelling. One study had people with normal cholesterol, high cholesterol, and even people already on statins drink a liter of mate daily. All groups saw LDL drop. And incredibly, the statin group saw an additional 13% drop on top of their medication.
Wow. So potential added benefit even for people already being treated.
Seems possible, yeah. The sources suggest maybe compounds block cholesterol absorption or production. Other studies showed less cell damage, better antioxidant status in women. Case studies linked high consumption in postmenopausal women to better heart health markers. So the cardioprotective angle involves antioxidants, slowing plaque, relaxing blood vessels, and that PON1 boost. They even mentioned triggering some kind of protective stress response in the heart.
And didn't temperature matter here too? The cold versus hot thing?
Yes. That study was fascinating. Comparing cold mate, 3 degrees C, to hot, 55 degrees C, the cold version actually showed better cardioprotective effects, reducing the heart's oxygen needs without speeding up heart rate. That's potentially huge for people with heart issues where stimulants are a concern.
That's a massive takeaway. How you drink it really might change its effect on your heart.
It really underscores how preparation method isn't just about taste.
Okay, another big one, weight reduction. What do the sources say about yerba mate for weight management?
The main link is to the methylxanthines, like caffeine, and their thermogenic effect. They can speed up metabolism, make you burn more calories, increase fat oxidation.
Helps burn more fuel, basically.
That's the idea. Could be why it's suggested for athletes or active people. One study combined it with exercise and found it boosted fat burning by around 23%. Plus, people felt fuller, more focused, more energetic.
So maybe it works well with exercise. Any other mechanisms?
Several. Lab and animal studies show it can inhibit pancreatic lipase, an enzyme you need to absorb fat from food. Less absorption means less fat stored. Obese mice studies showed less weight gain, less fat buildup. It also seems to affect fat cells directly, reducing the formation of new fat cells and how much fat gets stored in existing ones. Slows down fat tissue growth. The sources even mention it influencing genes related to fat creation and storage, kind of turning down the fat storing signals.
Wow, working at the cellular and even genetic level.
That's what the research suggests. Multiple angles. Less absorption, less storage, more burning. Plus, it might slow down how fast your stomach empties. Food stays longer, you feel fuller longer. Helps with appetite control. Might work even better combined with fiber.
What about that unhealthy belly fat around the organs?
Sources say it's shown potential to reduce visceral fat, especially in the liver. That's good for organ function and metabolic disease risk. It also seems to help regulate leptin, the satiety hormone, potentially reducing appetite further.
In temperature again. Any benefit to drinking it cold for weight?
Yes, same pattern. Cold mate, 3 degrees C, seemed to stimulate more thermogenesis and fat burning than hot, 55 degrees C, again without raising heart rate. Highlighted as a potential plus for obese individuals who might have heart risks. It also showed anti-inflammatory benefits in obesity models, improving inflammation markers, and maybe helping with leptin resistance.
Any human trials backing this up?
Yes, one 12-week study in obese people showed reduced body fat mass and percentage, partly credited to chlorogenic acid. Another trial comparing it to green tea in overweight people found yerba mate led to better improvements in HDL, good cholesterol, BMI, and leptin.
Quite a collection of potential weight-related benefits. That leads nicely into anti-diabetic properties.
Right. The sources look at its potential for both prevention and management, focusing on antioxidant effects and something called anti-glycation.
Anti-glycation, what's that and why is it relevant for diabetes?
Glycation is when sugars stick to proteins and fats, forming harmful things called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. These AGEs contribute to lots of long-term diabetic complications, damaging blood vessels, nerves, kidneys. Anti-glycation means stopping AGEs from forming. The sources say yerba mate extracts are pretty good at inhibiting AGE formation in lab tests, comparable to an anti-diabetic drug, and better than green tea in one study.
So it might help prevent those nasty long-term diabetes problems.
That's the potential suggested by the research cited. It's mostly attributed to the polyphenols, especially chlorogenic and caffeic acids. Because of this, it's seen as a possible natural add-on therapy. It also seems to help with insulin sensitivity and regulating blood sugar and fat metabolism, hitting aspects of metabolic syndrome. A clinical trial in diabetics and pre-diabetics found drinking mate improved their antioxidant status and, crucially, reduced AGE levels in the diabetic group. The takeaway was it could help reduce oxidative stress and potentially complications in type 2 diabetes.
Another trial with a mixed supplement, including Ilex paragariensis, also improved blood sugar control and cholesterol.
Seems promising for metabolic health overall. How about anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer effects? Strong animal evidence for anti-inflammatory action, like reducing lung inflammation from smoke, even reversing some damage. It lowered inflammatory markers by affecting key pathways. Mate saponins and ursolic acid seem involved. Also showed protective effects in models of inflammatory bowel disease and reduced inflammation linked to obesity and arthritis. Polyphenols like rutin are implicated too.
So a fairly broad anti-inflammatory effect in different models. What about cancer?
The sources mention lab studies showing yerba mate extracts can inhibit the growth of human colorectal cancer cells. Its potential in colorectal cancer prevention is being looked at, linked to anti-inflammatory effects and inducing apoptosis-programmed cell death in cancer cells. Interestingly, the sources note it seemed to have fewer side effects on the gut lining and kidneys compared to some other potential agents in animal models. In one mouse study, oral yerba mate extract reduced tumor growth and the formation of new blood vessels feeding the tumors without causing obvious side effects.
So hitting cancer cells in different ways, growth, death, blood supply.
That's what the cited research suggests is being explored, yeah.
Any other interesting, maybe less studied effects mentioned?
A few, yeah. Antimicrobial. Showed activity against some fungi and bacteria, suggesting maybe topical uses. Antiparasitic. Toxic to trypanosoma parasites, which cause things like Chagas disease, linked to tridorpins. Antiviral. Inhibited herpes simplex virus replication in studies, maybe through combined effects of compounds. Kidney-liver protection? Studies actually showed a protective effect on kidneys in damaged models, not harm. Also showed pain relief and liver protection in mice. And neuroprotection. This was interesting. Extracts protected dopamine neurons in culture, raising potential for Parkinson's prevention. The whole extract was better than isolated compounds like caffeine, and even better than some other known neuroprotective substances tested.
Wow, that is an incredibly diverse range of potential benefits covered in the sources. Energy, heart, weight, diabetes, inflammation, cancer, even brain health.
It really paints a picture of a plant with complex biological activities, likely due to that whole cocktail of compounds working together.
Given all that, it makes total sense the sources frame yerba mate as a functional food.
Yeah, exactly. With its rich profile of beneficial compounds and potential effects, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, heart health, metabolic benefits, regular consumption is seen as potentially contributing positively to health. The sources really highlight its potential for preventing cardiovascular risks and the synergy with exercise, especially for things like type 2 diabetes.
And it's not just the drink itself, the extracts can be used elsewhere.
Right. As a natural source of things like chlorogenic acid, extracts can be added to other foods. The example given was adding it to mayonnaise to boost nutrition and stop it spoiling so fast.
Versatile stuff.
Okay.
But we absolutely have to talk about the flip side, the potential risks, the controversies the sources brought up. This is crucial.
Extremely crucial. The sources do acknowledge statistical links observed, especially in heavy drinking regions of South America, between yerba mate consumption and higher rates of certain cancers.
Which cancers specifically?
Esophageal cancer comes up most strongly, but also cancers of the mouth, throat, larynx, and potentially others like lung, bladder, kidney.
Okay, that sounds serious. But this seemed like a huge, but in the sources, the link isn't necessarily with the plant itself.
Precisely. The sources repeatedly stress that this statistical association seems primarily tied to the traditional way it's consumed. Repeated infusions, yes, but very significantly, drinking it at extremely high temperatures.
So the sources are really pointing the finger at the heat, not the yerba.
That's the strong indication from the research presented. Two main theories are proposed. One is exposure to those PAH, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons formed during smoky processing. Even though only maybe 10% gets into the water, high repeated consumption could still add up. But the second mechanism, backed by multiple studies cited, is chronic thermal injury, basically. Repeatedly scalding the lining of your esophagus with very, very hot liquid.
Did the sources have specific studies supporting the temperature link?
They did. A study in Paraguay found drink temperature was a significant risk factor for esophageal cancer, more so than amount or duration. And crucially, drinking it cold showed no increased risk. A pooled analysis across South America also linked risk to both total intake and higher temps. A big study in Uruguay specifically linked drinking hot mate to increased risk for several cancers.
That's compelling evidence pointing towards heat being a major culprit.
It really seems to be. So the sources discuss ways to mitigate this. For producers, maybe switch to hot air drying instead of wood smoke to cut down PAHs. For consumers, the big one is simply don't drink it scalding hot. Let it cool down. Drink it warm, moderate, or cold like terray. That drastically reduces the thermal injury risk.
That feels like really practical, important advice for anyone drinking it or thinking of trying it. Any other precautions?
Just the standard caffeine warning sensitivity can mean insomnia, jitters, palpitations. And buying from reputable brands tested for contaminants like heavy metals or pesticides is always wise, although as we noted, levels were mostly low in the study cited, bar that one cadmium example.
Okay, so to sum up that critical caveat, cancer links exist statistically, but the sources strongly suggest it's mainly about drinking it super hot and maybe PAHs from processing, not the plant inherently. And changing how you drink it, especially temperature, might mitigate much of that risk.
That's the crucial nuance presented in the source material regarding this concern. It's about informed consumption.
Yeah. Wow. We have covered an immense amount of ground here, all based on the fantastic sources you provided. From ancient Guarani roots and that surprising detour to the Levant, through the botany, the complex processing with that key smoky element into the deep chemistry, and then this huge range of potential health effects.
Right. Simulation, antioxidants, heart health, weight, diabetes, inflammation, even neuroprotection.
It's incredibly multifaceted. These sources really gave us a solid base to explore it all.
Definitely. So quick recap. Yerba mate, Ilex paraguariensis, traditional South American drink, deep cultural roots.
Yeah.
Packed with potentially beneficial compounds, polyphenols, methylxanthines, saponins. Research suggests a wide array of possible health pluses.
But the big asterisk, Potential cancer links seem primarily tied to the traditional habit of drinking it extremely hot, and maybe PAH from processing. Modifying how you prepare it, especially lowering the temperature, is suggested by the sources as a key way to reduce potential risks.
Exactly. It's a complex, fascinating beverage. Rich history, promising health aspects, but also needs awareness around preparation.
Seriously, this was a fantastic topic to dive into. Thank you so much for sharing all that material that let us do this deep dive.
It was great fun exploring it with you.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about that balance? How do we honor these deep-rooted cultural traditions while also integrating what modern science tells us about health and risk?
That's a big question, yeah. Applies to so much more than just yerba mate.
It really does. Something for all of us to consider. Keep asking questions, stay curious, keep learning. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Until the next one.
See you then.